The warriors who defied the British Empire, the Maroons of Jamaica. Hidden deep in the mountains, they built free communities, waged wars against an empire, and left behind a legacy that still echoes today. In this video, you will discover how men and women who were once enslaved became fearless warriors, how they resisted the British Empire at its height, not just surviving, but creating a society rooted in freedom. But how did they do it? How could runaway slaves, hunted and outnumbered, face one of the most powerful armies in the world and win? To answer this, we must go back to the very beginning. Before the British, before the Maroons, before Jamaica was even called Jamaica. When Christopher Columbus arrived in 1494, the island was home to the Taino people, who called it Saimaca, land of wood and water. They were skilled farmers, fishermen, and navigators, with thriving communities that stretched across the Caribbean. But within a few decades of Spanish conquest, disease and brutality devastated them. The Taino population, once in the tens of thousands, was reduced to near extinction. With the indigenous population destroyed, the Spanish turned to the transatlantic slave trade. Ship after ship brought Africans to the island, torn from kingdoms and wars on the continent. Many came from the Akan-speaking regions of West Africa, people already experienced in organized warfare. The Spanish used this labor to build plantations and settlements, but their control of the island was fragile. In 1655, when the English launched an invasion of Jamaica, chaos erupted. The Spanish tried to resist, but their hold crumbled. Amid the fighting, groups of enslaved Africans seized their chance at freedom. They disappeared into the island's thick forests and rugged mountains. To the Spanish, they were cimarrones, wild, untamed ones. To the English, they became known as the Maroons. From the very beginning, their existence was an act of defiance. In the wilderness, they forged new lives, planting yam and plantain fields, hunting wild hogs, and raising families beyond the reach of slaveholders. They carried with them fragments of West African culture, language, music, spiritual practices, and wove them into a new Jamaican identity. But the Maroons were not content with simply hiding. They waged guerrilla warfare against colonizers, raiding plantations, freeing the enslaved, and vanishing back into the mountains. They learned to use the island's geography as a weapon. For the British, the mountains became a nightmare. False trails, hidden signals, sudden ambushes, an enemy they could never fully see. Outnumbered and outgunned, the Maroons still became a force that would shape Jamaica's history for centuries to come. High in the blue mountains of eastern Jamaica, one of the most famous Maroon communities took root. It was known as Nanny Town, home to hundreds of men, women, and children who had escaped slavery. Life here was not easy, but it was free. Women planted crops, men hunted wild game, and children grew up never knowing the whip of a slave master. Nanny Town was led by a remarkable figure, remembered simply as Nanny of the Maroons. Part elder, part spiritual guide, and part war leader, Nanny's influence was legendary. Some accounts describe her as a healer and seer, deeply connected to African spiritual traditions. Others portray her as a fierce strategist who inspired courage in her people. Even British observers admitted she commanded absolute loyalty. Across the island, in the western hills, another powerful leader emerged, Cudjoe. Unlike Nanny, who often drew on spiritual authority, Cudjoe was known as a hardened warrior and a shrewd negotiator. He built fortified settlements, trained his fighters, and directed raids against plantations with military precision. Both leaders represented different styles of leadership, one spiritual, one martial. But together they embodied the strength of the Maroon movement. The Maroons were not just fighters, they were innovators in the art of resistance. They transformed the land itself into a weapon. Using the abeng, a cow horn fashioned into a war trumpet, they could communicate across vast distances in the mountains. To the British, the sudden sound of the horn was a warning. The Maroons were near. In battle, they struck swiftly and vanished. British soldiers, unfamiliar with the terrain, stumbled into ambushes or became lost in the dense forests. Maroon warriors fought with stolen muskets, machetes, and spears, moving with a speed that left their enemies in disarray. For the enslaved still trapped on plantations, the Maroons became a symbol of hope. Many risked their lives to escape and join them in the hills. Others passed secret messages to Maroon scouts, feeding them intelligence about British troop movements. By the early 1700s, Maroon raids were constant. Plantations burned, crops were destroyed, and slaveholders lived in fear. A planter's diary lamented that, "Our men dare not look them in the face in the open ground, or in equal numbers." The British Crown, embarrassed by these defeats, began sending professional soldiers to crush the Maroons once and for all. But the results were always the same. Redcoats marched into the forests, only to be harassed, trapped, and cut down. Every failure made the legend of the Maroons grow. For the enslaved, it was proof that the empire was not invincible. Still, with every victory came new dangers. The British would not stop, and the pressure on the Maroon communities grew heavier with each passing year. The stage was set for a confrontation that would define not just the future of the Maroons, but of Jamaica itself. By the 1720s, the British had fully replaced the Spanish as rulers of Jamaica. Plantations multiplied, and the enslaved population soared from hundreds to tens of thousands. The island became one of the empire's most profitable colonies, powered by sugar and built on the backs of Africans. But while the British celebrated their gains, the Maroons were watching. Hidden in the hills, they struck with increasing boldness. Entire estates were torched in the night. Enslaved people were liberated, armed, and folded into Maroon ranks. The planters could not sleep without fear of the forest erupting into flame. In 1722, British expansion along the northeast coast pushed them dangerously close to Nanny. The Maroons answered with fury. Plantation after plantation was raided, forcing many slaveholders to abandon their lands entirely. British soldiers sent to restore order found themselves stalked, outmaneuvered, and annihilated. By 1730, the situation had become critical. The Jamaican governor warned that the very survival of the colony was at stake. The Crown dispatched regiments of trained soldiers determined to end the Maroon threat once and for all. But the mountains belonged to the Maroons. Soldiers stumbled into traps laid with terrifying precision, false trails, sudden ambushes, and coordinated attacks guided by the obeying horn. British losses mounted, while Maroon casualties remained few. One commander admitted that the rebels got the better of all our parties. The most famous of these encounters came in the early 1730s, when nearly 400 British troops marched on Nanny. They split their forces, hoping to block escape routes. But the Maroons saw them coming. From behind rocks and trees, they erupted in gunfire and war cries. Panic spread through the British lines as soldiers fell in waves. Survivors fled in confusion, leaving the mountains to their enemies once more. This victory electrified the enslaved population. Whispers spread across the island that the Maroons were unstoppable, that freedom was possible. More runaways escaped to the hills, swelling the ranks of Nanny's people. For the British, the situation was humiliating. The colony's economy was bleeding, its plantations abandoned, and its soldiers unable to secure even basic control. At one emergency meeting, the legislature admitted the Maroons had grown in power, to the great terror of His Majesty's subjects. Desperate, the British escalated their campaign. In 1734, they quietly scaled a narrow mountain path leading to Nanny. Small cannons were dragged into position, and the settlement was bombarded. Huts went up in flames. Forced to flee, the Maroons lost their stronghold. But even in defeat, they struck back. In the skirmishes that followed, Maroon warriors killed 80 British soldiers before melting once again into the forests. For a time, the Windward Maroons dispersed, but the fire of resistance was not extinguished. Within a few short years, they would regroup, rearm, and return to the fight. and the British would finally realize that the only way to end this war might not be through victory, but through negotiation. By the mid-1730s, the British had thrown everything they could at the Maroons: soldiers, militias, cannons, yet the war dragged on. Their plantations were in ruins, their profits collapsing. For the enslaved still on the plantations, the hills glimmered like a beacon of hope. For the British, they had become a nightmare with no end in sight. At last, colonial officials admitted what soldiers could not: the Maroons were unconquerable. If Jamaica was to remain profitable, peace had to be bought, on the Maroons' terms. In 1739, representatives of the British Crown met with Cudjoe, leader of the Leeward Maroons. The treaty they offered was extraordinary. The Maroons were granted 1,500 acres of land around their settlements, land they would own outright. They were allowed to hunt almost anywhere on the island and to trade freely in colonial towns. In short, the British recognized their independence. It was an unprecedented moment, an empire conceding defeat to formerly enslaved people. For the Maroons, it meant safety, stability, and a future beyond constant war. But it came with a price. The treaty required Cudjoe and his people to assist the British in putting down slave rebellions. Even more devastating, it demanded that any enslaved African who escaped and sought refuge with the Maroons be captured and returned to the plantations. The decision split the Maroons themselves. Some of Cudjoe's warriors saw the agreement as a betrayal of their African brothers and sisters still enslaved. Rumors of revolt spread through his camps, but Cudjoe stood firm. He had seen the strength of the British, their endless supply of soldiers and ships. For him, the treaty was not about betrayal. It was about survival. If refusing meant the destruction of his people, then compromise, however painful, was the only path forward. Was he wrong? Was he right? Historians still debate it. Some say Cudjoe chose peace to protect his people from annihilation. Others see it as the moment the Maroons turned their backs on the very cause of freedom they embodied. Soon after, the British turned to the Windward Maroons. Nanny, whose people had long fought ferociously, was cornered. Facing war not only with the British, but with Cudjoe's now allied Leeward Maroons, she had little choice. In 1740, she too signed a treaty echoing Cudjoe's terms. For the enslaved, the dream of fleeing to the hills for sanctuary was shattered. The very communities that once symbolized liberation were now bound by treaty to return them to bondage. Yet for the Maroons, the treaties ensured survival. They preserved their lands, their traditions, and their independence, something rare in a Caribbean world dominated by slavery. The question lingers: did Cudjoe and Nanny save their forests, or did they sacrifice the trees? Was it leadership, or was it betrayal? Perhaps both. Perhaps, in the brutal reality of empire, there were no perfect choices, only the choices that let their people live to see another day. The treaties ended the First Maroon War, but they did not end the tensions. With their independence secured, the Maroons now lived in a strange middle ground, free themselves, but bound to defend the very system they had once fought against. For the enslaved, hope dimmed. The hills no longer promised freedom. Runaways who reached Maroon settlements were captured and delivered back to the plantations. Some were punished brutally for daring to run. To many, it felt like betrayal. But the British had not gained complete control. Maroons were not submissive allies. They were independent nations with their own leaders, land, and culture. They traded in towns, but they remained outsiders to colonial society. Their settlements grew, their children were born free, and their traditions survived, an achievement nearly unmatched anywhere else in the Caribbean. Still, the uneasy peace would not last forever. In 1791, news of revolution exploded from the north. Enslaved Africans in Saint-Domingue had risen in rebellion. The Haitian Revolution had begun, and it sent shockwaves across the Caribbean. Planters in Jamaica trembled, fearing their own enslaved people would rise next. Their fears were not unfounded. Rebellions erupted across Jamaica in the years that followed, and in 1795, tensions between the British and the Maroons of Trelawney Town, once led by Cudjoe, boiled over into open conflict. Known as the Second Maroon War, it reignited the old cycle of guerrilla raids and ambushes. But this time, the balance had shifted. The British scorched maroon crops, cut down forests, and starved their opponents into surrender. In the end, more than 500 Maroons were deported, banished first to the freezing winters of Nova Scotia, then to Sierra Leone in West Africa. There, many would remain, exiles from the island they once called home. And yet, the story did not end in defeat. Some Maroons eventually returned to Jamaica after slavery was abolished in the 1830s. Others endured in their mountain strongholds, their communities never erased. To this day, Maroon towns like Accompong still stand, living testament to a people who refused to be broken. Their legacy is complex. They were warriors of freedom, yet also enforcers of slavery. They fought the British to a standstill, yet signed treaties that bound them to empire. They were both inspiration and contradiction, survival and sacrifice. But perhaps that is why their story matters so deeply, because history is rarely simple. The Maroons remind us that freedom is not won in pure victories, but in the hard choices, the compromises, and the resilience to endure. They were more than rebels. They were farmers, leaders, mothers, fathers, and children who carved a life in defiance of the greatest empire of their time. The warriors who defied the British Empire, the Maroons of Jamaica. Their story is not just one of resistance, it is one of survival, legacy, and the unyielding human demand to live free.